Did you want to say anything about PayPal or?
Yeah, it's very basically, I think most of you are aware of PayPal, or you probably use it also. So ours is a kind of a, we have private cloud, internal cloud. It's about 130K nodes sitting here with 20,000 servers, and most of them are virtualized. And one neat thing about this talk today is a highly secure cloud. That means the data cannot be unencrypted anywhere. So if you got the security encryption is there, and on the fly it has to go through SSL between the machines also, inside the cloud. So it's a very highly secure environment because it needs to be CCA compatible, compliant, sorry. So that's why we keep it like that. So this talking very relevant to us and probably really like to do. And of course we do have, look at this open.
Could you put him on the mic, please?
Done.
Let's do one more time. People really want to listen.
Yeah, so.
Okay.
Let's go to a sec.
Again, really? If you want to have some brief comments maybe, that people can hear about.
As I was telling, we have a private cloud, and it's a hybrid cloud actually. It's a private cloud, most of us stay here because of security reasons. As you know, the PayPal is almost like a bank, it's a financial company. So we have highly real constraints for the data sitting here, either in stationary data or in transit data. And we have to be PCI compliant, so the data have to be encrypted between the machines if it is on the network, and has to stay encrypted on the disk. And so this talk is very relevant to us, and I think some of the PayPal people are also here, I think, hopefully they're listening. And if anybody of you is interested in, because you're all in the security area, if you're interested in the PayPal, we have jobs open. And you can continue. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you very much. And thank you for the pizza.
So a little bit about ACM. So our local chapter was founded in 1957. We're a nonprofit run by paid volunteers, just for the fun of it, because we like to learn, like to get back to the community. So we have monthly seminars like this. So usually on the third Wednesday of the month, we have a general computing talk, such as tonight's. On the fourth Monday of the month, we generally have a data science talk. So I invite a lot of the speakers for the data science. I'm open to suggestions for speakers. You can find us on meetup.com. We're doing a recording, as you can see the cameras. We're going to post it up later on in our YouTube channel. So you can see YouTube Sfbayacm, and that has about 130 of our more recent talks. So you can check that out. It might take about, what's the typical time to get it posted up on YouTube?
About 2 weeks.
Okay. So some upcoming ACM events. So faster data science and best practices for building AI-enabled applications. So that's on Monday, August 27th. Advanced vision recognition with Ask RCNN. So that'll be on Monday, September 19th at Walmart Labs. And then rapid adoption of cloud warehouse technology using Hypercube. Okay, yeah, on Wednesday. And then check our meetup page for updates. We're always inviting volunteers or sponsors. So we're looking for location sponsors to host us. We're looking for speakers. And then if you are interested in becoming a volunteer, our council meets once a month, usually the first Monday of the month at a pizza place by Volunteers Pizza, talk about planning upcoming speakers and events. We also have Saturday training classes that we're working on planning as well. And we do other things like in the Judge for the Science Fair is one of the activities that we're involved in. So Bob, I do also had some interest in the science fair, so maybe we can also talk about that sometime. So now I'll pass the microphone to the audience.
So inviting people to say, oh, my company is hiring in some kind of computing position, or, oh, you should check out this other meetup group or Bay Area conference that people in the audience might be interested in. So I'll go from one side of the room to the other. So raise your hand and I can pass the microphone to you.
You need to hold the mic closer to you.
Okay, thank you. Raise your hand if you have any announcement, your company's hiring, or other cool meetups, local conferences, anything that you want to talk about? Yes? Let me walk over. I give a name and company and information.
Hi, my name is Laura. I'm an engineer and I'm also looking for another technical co-founder for a software platform called Sfbayacm081518, which is for intellectual property creation. So contact me if you're interested.
What's the search term again to use?
It's ip-mate.ch. We're a Swiss company, but you can come up to me and I'll give you a chart.
Yeah, if you like, later on you can write it on a whiteboard. There's a marker underneath.
I have cards too, so come talk to me if you're interested.
Okay. Any other announcements? Job hiring, events, fun things to talk about? So I wrote something down, there's a marker here on the floor if anybody wants to write things. I'm hiring data scientists, at Foghorn Systems in Mountain View. So we work on a lot of data mining projects from deep learning to traditional data mining prediction, outlier detection, or Internet of Things type of projects and clients. So I joined in February with a team of 3, and now I'm hiring my 10th person. So we're growing fast, doubling in size this calendar year due to our second round of funding. I left some business cards and a chair by the door, but I don't know if that chair got moved or the cards got moved. So that's my announcement. And as I mentioned about the cameras, so the microphone on the speakers will just pick up what the speaker is saying. We'd like to record for the YouTube channel the audience questions. So if you keep your questions short to like 30 seconds, we ask the speakers to repeat the question. So the question will be picked up on their mic, and then the audience will hear, and then the speaker can give their answer. So try to keep your questions short. If you give a 2-minute preamble, we may pull you off the stage. So now I'd like to invite the speakers, or talk about the speakers. So there's Sfbayacm and Bob Ziebman. So Sfbayacm has been working on intellectual property law for about 18 years. He's counseled on a variety of areas. Bob Ziebman has been working on Ziebman Consulting. So he does a lot of forensic engineering. And so he has some forensic engineering software kind of checking to see if there's been IP theft on software. So that's just what he's worked on being an expert witness in over 200 cases on intellectual property. So tonight we'll have some more details talking about the intellectual property. So please help me have a warm round of applause for the 2 speakers.
So while our speakers are coming to the stage, we are going to announce 2 lucky winners today. If you got a ticket, keep it in hand. We'll be calling out the numbers. We have 2 books to give away. One book is about learning how to design digital circuits with FPGA, field programmable gate arrays, and devices. The other book is about interactive data visualization from the web. So we'll be calling numbers, and if you have the tickets in handy, please come in and take the book that you like. Leanna, would you please pull the ticket out? Thank you.
Last 4 digits, 3752.
3752. If you have the ticket, come over and get the book. All right, 3752. We have a winner.
Last 4 digits, 3746.
3746. Yes.
Yes.
2 winners. Congratulations.
This is long-term number.
Also, if you haven't silenced your phone, now would be a good time.
Hi, my name is Sfbayacm081518. As they mentioned, I'm a patent attorney, so I have a background in EE. And before I went into law, I was a design engineer in the audio group at National Semiconductor. This is way before they were acquired by TI. But then I moved into law, or into the field of law.
I think you already have set up for this.
Okay.
So this is that
Yeah. SR one is for the YouTube recording and the other is for the speakers in the room.
How's this? Can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So as I was saying, so I've been doing patent law for about 20 years. For most of that time, I've been specializing in startups, and my background's in EE, so I do primarily. Sorry.
Yeah, two on purpose.
Okay, just for the recording, I'll start over. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Sfbayacm081518. I am a patent attorney. I've been practicing patent law for about 20 years. I specialize in startups, and my background's in electrical engineering, so I do a lot of work for startups involved in software. So I'm specializing in software patents for startups for about the last 15 of my 20 years working. So just as for a show of hands, I did a similar presentation to what I'm going to talk about today last year. Who here is familiar with that presentation from last year? Okay, so this is going to be new for many of you, so good. So there will be some new material that's specific to some recent developments since last year's presentation, but I'm glad this is still going to be new information, hopefully useful for most of you. So before we get into patent, yes?
Sometimes people in the audience ask for a copy of the slides. After the presentation, would it be possible to post a link to the slides on our meetup?
Absolutely.
So on the meetup for this event, there's a discussion session below. So if you just post a link to any slides or related content of interest.
Okay, yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you.
So what we're going to talk about today is IP, in particular patents for software. So before we dive into patentability of software, I am going to talk just a little bit in general about IP in general, the different types of IP, and then we'll get into patents in particular. And we'll kind of take a startup focus, but if anybody has any questions about IP for a company other than a startup, let me know, and we can talk about that briefly as well. But in particular, what we'll talk about is when a startup should consider patent protection, when is software potentially patentable for a startup, and some do's and some don'ts for patents for startups in software. So intellectual property, what is intellectual property? Well, it's basically a tangible right that's created when somebody does some sort of creative process. So whether they conceive an invention, or are selling a product and they come up with a name, or just they're creating some sort of original authorship in a tangible medium. Those things are collectively called intellectual property. So there's several types of intellectual property. There's patents, which protect a new and novel and non-obvious conception or invention. It can be a design or some sort of utility invention or other type of subject matter. Trademarks, which are it's a name associated with a product, and the strength of the trademark, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is developed when you use that product associated with that name. Copyrights, which Bob is going to talk about in more detail later, but basically a copyright is a right that is granted to an author when they create a work of authorship. trade secrets. So trade secrets is when you want to you invent something similar to the subject matter of a patent, but you want to keep it a secret for whatever reason. You don't want the public to know about it. One thing about patents is when you apply for a patent with the United States Patent Office, when the patent is issued, it becomes public knowledge. And typically, 18 months after you file the application, the patent application, it becomes published as well. So in some cases, that may not be desirable for someone who wants to protect their technology. So the other way to do that is just keep it a trade secret. We're not going to go into trade secrets in much detail here today, but I have a whole other presentation I've done on trade secrets, as well as a kind of a cheat sheet for startups about what to keep in mind for trade secrets and whether to do to protect an invention with a trade secret or patent. So if anybody has any questions about trade secrets, you can find me, contact me, either leave a card at the end or send me an email. I'll be happy to provide you with that information. So let's talk briefly about patents. So in order to get a patent, you have to apply for it. It's not created automatically. And what the government grants you in a patent, if you're successful in your application, is a right to prevent others from making, using, or selling, or importing an invention for a set period of time. So it doesn't necessarily give you the right to practice your invention, but it allows you to prevent others from making or using it or selling it. Like I mentioned earlier, once a patent is granted, it's published for the whole world to see. So in exchange for that right to prevent others from making, using, or selling it, it's published, so everybody else can see it too. They're not supposed to do anything or copy it because you have the patent, but they are going to be able to see it. It helps them kind of put them on notice that they are not supposed to be doing this. So the intent is to provide a limited monopoly, and it's limited in that it's for a set period of time, and it's only for what is talked about in the patent for that set period of time. So what are some of the requirements for patents? It must be novel and non-obvious over the prior art. So it must be new. It must not be something that is done like that before. That's usually a pretty simple and easy hurdle to overcome. It must also be non-obvious. And this is kind of like the voodoo term for a lot of people. What does non-obvious mean? Well, when the patent office receives your patent application, they determine whether or not it's patentable. They'll look at many other different types of what's called prior art, which is different references, different inventions that were done before. And mostly those prior art references are other patents or published patent applications. So what they'll do is they'll take one or two or three, or there's really no specific limit to what they can consider. They'll look at things that are similar, maybe a part here, a piece here, a part there, and say, collectively, would your invention be obvious to try in light of all these other things that are out there? When you apply for the patent application, it must be described in detail, and this is especially true for software patents. As we'll get into a little later, there's been a lot of press and developments in the law with respect to whether or not a software patent is, whether or not software is patentable. And a lot of that depends on whether the software describes a technical innovation. So not just that is an overall process new and not being done before, but is it improved technology or solve a technical problem? And that requires a lot of technical detail in the applications. We'll get to that in a little bit more detail, but the invention must be described in detail in both the descriptions and drawings that support the description. It also includes claims which describe what you would prevent others from making, using, or selling. It can cover a utility or a design. So a utility would be something that's functional. Most software would be a utility. The design is just something, the appearance of something. So like a lot of mechanical devices are designed patents. A screen interface, if you think that's something you want to protect, that would be a design patent application. And then there's also a few different types of patent applications. There's a provisional and a non-provisional application. So a non-provisional patent application is the full application with all the parts and pieces that's examined by the patent office, which can eventually become patentable. A provisional application is kind of like a step in the door application. It doesn't require as many parts as a non-provisional patent application. In particular, you don't have to describe initially the claims, which recite what you would prevent others from making, using, or selling. A provisional is often cheaper than a non-provisional patent application, both in the U.S. Patent Office fees and the attorney fees, which is why it's very often a very desirable option for a lot of startups. Oftentimes when startups are applying for the first patent for whatever reason, which we'll talk about in a second, they often go for provisionals first just because it's cheaper and quicker and they can just kind of get it done quickly without having to spend more resources and time and waiting to get non-provisional patents. One thing about a provisional patent is it does expire in 12 months. So you have to follow up with a non-provisional patent within 12 months. So trademarks, as we mentioned before, it protects a name that's associated with a particular product or service. For example, cola. There's many companies that have trademarks for cola. There's Coca-Cola, Pepsi, all types. It can be just a strict name, in text, or it can be a symbol, it can be a graphical design, anything that's distinctive. If you're trying, it's very difficult to get a trademark, or impossible, for something that's generic. For example, if you have tissues and you're trying to trademark, you're trying to sell them as tissue brand tissues. It's a very generic name, and you're not going to be able to prevent anybody else from associating that name with that type of product. Descriptive marks, such as white tissue, that wouldn't do much, get you much further. Distinctive requirements for trademarks are required over the generic names or descriptive names. A mark must be used in interstate commerce. It's been found that as long as you just use it over the web is considered, far-reaching. So as long as you're using your mark over the internet, that will usually suffice as long as you're associating the name with your product on pages of your web page. And the protection is obtained by use, as well as registration with the U.S. Patent Office. So with a trademark, you don't necessarily have to file a registration in order to protect the mark and build the mark. The strength of a mark is with use. So whether you do pamphlets or put it on the product or put it on the internet, that's how you increase the use of a trademark. Copyright protection is the last type of IP that we'll touch on briefly. It protects the original work of authorship that's put in some sort of tangible form. For software, that tangible form would be memory or flash drive or some other storage device. It protects the copyright owner from reproduction, derivations, and distribution. Standard clauses, things that you're just maybe getting from pre-existing code, something you're not really writing yourself from scratch, that's not protectable, or if it's very similar. If it's, it must be independently created code. It's created automatically with authorship, so you don't need to file for copyright registration in order to protect it. The copyright registration protection is automatically granted as soon as you just write it up, as long as it's an independently created code. There are benefits to registering it, but many people don't register their code unless there becomes an issue. And in that case, you can register it simultaneously with pursuing legal options with that code. So patents for startups. So I've never walked into a startup for the first time and have them giving me a high five. No startup is super excited to see the patent attorney. They'd rather be working on developing their product or working on fundraising, dealing with other exciting things that are in the lives of a startup entrepreneur. But there are some reasons why a startup would want a patent, even though it's probably not so common and why they started their startup. The number one reason for a startup is to attract investment. A lot of investors will want to see that their investment in your company is just going to have a minimal risk. They want to see that there's a reduction in the risk for them putting money in you. And part of that reduction in risk is that they have some peace of mind that you have some patents pending, or at least a plan for how you're going to prevent others from your technology. And a lot of that can be filing some sort of patent. Very few startups have a patent, but a lot of times if you just file a provisional application, which is the cheap version of the patent application, you can say it's patent pending. And a lot of times investors will say, okay, they have something patent pending, or they have a plan, where they're, once they have some investment, they're gonna dedicate some to IP. So one reason why patents are valuable for startups is to attract investment. Another is to prevent theft of innovations by third parties. So a lot of startups operate in stealth mode, at least for the first several months, maybe even a year or longer. So not many outside companies are really gonna have the opportunity to steal what you're doing. And usually what you're doing is new, so they're not going to, it's not gonna be public knowledge what you're doing. Where this comes into play for a startup is if you have a partner. So if you have a joint development agreement, or you have some other company that's adding some feature or co-developing some service with you. A lot of times you need to provide your object code or source code to them so that to make sure everything's going to be, your interface is going to work well, the data is going to work well back and forth. Giving away this information can be tempting for some companies. I remember I represented a company. They weren't necessarily a startup, but they got this. They did some audio development technology, and they got a huge contract and offer from this very large cell phone maker. Let's call them Banana. So this company Banana that makes cell phones, they said, yes, we love your audio processing technology. All we need is your source code. Of course, here's an we'll sign your NDAs. And they gave them contracts for a couple of years, and they worked together. But then this bigger company said, I think it was nice working with you, but I think we're going to go in a different direction. And then after that agreement, they just they developed something very similar on their own. So it just goes to show that, and this company even had some patents covering their technology. So I think even those, not many companies are going to steal what a startup is doing, because most startups have a head start. When you have joint development agreements, that could be something to keep an eye on and a reason to consider patent infringement. I'm sorry, consider patent protection. Speaking of infringement, avoid litigation. No startup wants to or has the resources to engage in litigation. I worked with a company the inventors left a larger company, started their own, and 3 years into their company, they were sued by the company they left because they had this amazing product. It was blowing away the company they left, and they were just completely taking over the market share. And one thing that really saved them is that they had a couple of issued patents and lots of patents pending that they just used for cross-licensing. When a company decides whether or not they're going to sue another company, no matter how big or small, they're going to do their due diligence first. Does this company have any applications pending, any applications published, or any issued patents? And if they have anything like that, they're going to realize that if we sue them, they're just going to sue us right back. So we're going to incur costs, and it might just settle out of court anyway. They might still send threats, but having patents to assert back can just really help in negotiating a way out of litigation. Did you raise your hand for a question? Or okay. Yes. Okay. So when should a startup consider patents? Well, based on those things we talked about, those are the key points. So if you're going to look for VC funding, I would say 2 to 4 months before you're applying, consider whether or not those VCs may want to see a patent pending and file for a provisional patent. If you're entering a contract with a third party, at some point before you disclose the details of your technology, do before then. And then if your company is really successful or is on track to take away competitor market share, you should definitely be considering whether to obtain any patent protection. So what are some benefits for startups? Very briefly, there was a study done by Harvard Business School about companies that have filed for their own patents, how did they do later on? So the patents don't necessarily mean you're going to be successful. If you get a patent, that doesn't guarantee success. But startup companies that file for patents and actually obtain a patent are typically those that experience success, such as employment growth, sales growth increases, more likely to get VC funding, And more likely, they're going to go public and be listed on the stock exchange. So we talked about the patentability requirements for software. I'll go over these very briefly again. It must be new and novel. It must not be obvious. It must be patentable subject matter. So it must be some subject matter that's useful or useful improvement thereof. And so that patentable subject matter issue is what has been cited against software. So the issue whether software is patentable subject matter under 101 is related to some judicial exclusions of some things that are recognized as not being patentable subject matter. Those include laws of nature like gravity, natural phenomena like light, and abstract ideas. So and it's the abstract ideas that have been cited against software patents. Whether or not a potential software patent application just cites an abstract idea. And this was first set forth in a Supreme Court case of Alice Corp versus CLS Bank. So not getting too much case law details, but basically it's for an online escrow service. So typically when you buy a house, the buyer and the seller both give their information and documents to the escrow agent. The escrow agent holds things until everything's checked off, and then they file the recordings, and that way there's just a third party handling those things. So CLS Bank wanted to do that thing, wanted to just implement that online. So the process had been done a long time, there was nothing new about it, they just did it through a website. It was determined to be not patentable, and then came lots of media attention saying software isn't patentable. As part of that, there was a two-part test, and ultimately it came down to, does software, which is considered to be an abstract idea, do the claims recite significantly more than that abstract idea? So what exactly is an abstract idea? Well, the Supreme Court said we don't need to really determine what an abstract idea is. We'll let the lesser courts figure that out. So in response to this case, the U.S. Patent Office tried to clarify with lots of examples and guidelines. One of the most recent guidelines, before I go into this one, does anyone here actually prosecute patent applications? So does anyone here have experience once you filed the application? Has anyone had any interaction with the patent office to deal with the rejection? Okay, let's see. So some of the more recent USPTO guidance has addressed that aspect of interacting with the US Patent Office and responding to the rejections, and made it more difficult for an examiner to summarize their rejections and not put in much detail. So at this point, based on this most recent guidance, they have to cite actual evidence why an abstract, what they assert is an abstract idea, why it is understood, routine, or conventional. So it's now a question of fact that an examiner has to prove as fact. Maybe that's more information than we needed here, but it's just one of the updates that's come out in the last year. So here's some examples of things that are abstract ideas. So human activities done by a computer. So there's a lot of software for meal planning, playing board games or card games. Those things have been done for a long time. Just putting them in computer form is not patentable. Well-known economic and financial practices. So doing electronic escrow service, hedging and investing, providing a clearinghouse. Those are business practices that have been around for tens, decades of years, and those things are not patentable because simply putting them into a computer form is nothing new. And then also mathematical formula, things that are naturally existing. Procedures for conversions, organizing information. The formula themselves are not novel or patentable. A specific application of a particular formula could be patentable, but broadly trying to patent a formula in and of itself is not patentable. So some things that the U.S. Patent Office has determined to matter significantly more. Improvements to technology with a technical field. Improvements to a function of the computer itself, such as making memory retrieval happening quicker, making a more efficient processing. Things that improve how the computer works. Software that does that can potentially be patentable because it addresses a technical question or achieves some sort of technical solution. If it's inexplicably tied to computer technology, such as what's what I'm looking for? Encryption. So encryption, only deals with computers, it deals with bits and things like that, and deals with data files. So something like that is only tied to computer technology. It was never really tied to, I guess technically maybe with something, but historically and traditionally it wasn't tied to anything done by hand. So encryption would be something that's tied to computer technology, so it's more likely to be patentable than not, at least as far as the subject matter. And then there's several case law that support things that are rooted in technology, an improvement of computer functionality, automated process that differ from prior processes. Those things are patentable. So I know I have limited time, so I want to kind of move forward and wrap this up a little bit. So let's get to the best practices. So with all these things that have come out in the last couple of years, and based on 20 years experience, I have a few tips for if you're going to move forward with patent protection, what I would, things I would keep in mind, or I suggest you keep in mind. So one is to aim for the moon. Try and keep your patent application as broad as possible. Typically, you have a core invention which differs from the technology of your competitors, in some way, as formed by these different smaller bubbles or circles. Aim for the moon, and try and describe your invention as broadly as possible. And by that I mean, so if your competitor was going to work this into their, your novel feature into their product, what would that look like from their point of view? And try and cover, those features in that application. You don't have to have a prototype or have to, have a working version of what you're trying to patent. You just have to be able to describe it in detail so that somebody else making or using it can figure it out with some reasonable experimentation. The second is include lots of details and lots of technical information that's related to the computer technology, how it would improve computer operation, how it would meet some of these case law requirements. It's going to make life much easier once the application is examined. Perhaps one of the most underappreciated but most important ones is interview the examiner. So once you file your application, it's going to go through some formality checks, and then it's eventually going to be signed to a patent examiner. That examiner is going to review it, look for prior art, and send you an off section. You have the opportunity to call him and interview him and talk about the application. This is a huge deal. The USPTO examiner, they have these guidelines. They're supposed to be objective. They're supposed to follow these rules, but they're people. I had, in one of my clients, they had, I think 19 pending patent applications. 17 of them were with the same examiner. We did not want to upset this examiner. So every time we had any sort of communication from him, I'd give him a call, touch base, kind of check in to see how he's doing, and then also talk about the issue. But I also make it personal whenever I talk to him. So I knew his girlfriend's name. I knew, I knew when his vacation was going to be. I knew he was going to propose to his girlfriend 2 weeks before she did. And then he told me at some point, she said, yes, we're going to get married. I guess we're going to have kids because that's just what people do. And he told me, we've exchanged thoughts about kids. He and I knew each other really well. Is he going to do me special favors and kind of do things under the hood that's inappropriate? No, of course not. But that if you do have a personal relationship, they're more likely to help you. So like what he would do sometimes is, hey, I received this new case from you. As it is, it's not patentable, but have you ever thought of maybe, tweaking like this, pulling this part of the specification there? They're more likely to give you suggestions or just to make things more efficient or save you time. So interviewing the USPTO examiner to personalize that relationship makes a big difference. And then, of course, developing an IP portfolio plan. Maybe you don't need patents. Maybe a better option is to keep your technologies a trade secret. That's something that's best to plan, ahead of time rather than right before you're going for VC funding. And then what types of IP? You want patents or trademarks or copyrights? And of course, you got to have a budget and timeline and realistic goals. And then once you have this plan, you got to make sure your engineers know this, so the whole company is aware of what the plan is and how you're going to implement it. And then public disclosures. So in the United States, if your invention is made public, and then by public, I mean, are the core details, the material details made, public information, either through a conference or a white paper or some other way that somebody could find it if they were looking for it. That triggers a 12-month bar period during which you have to file your application. If you make it public and then wait more than 12 months before you file a patent application on it, it's going to be rejected, and it's just free to anybody who wants to use it. For most foreign countries, once something's made public, it's not patentable at all. So it's a very good idea. If you have a good idea, just keep it a secret until you decide whether or not you want to file a patent application. Especially if you want to, if trade secret protection might be, an option for you, then you need to keep it. It's only protected as a trade secret as long as you keep it a secret, make reasonable efforts to keep it a secret. Open source. Almost all software companies that have a staff of 2 or 3 or 4 programmers are going to be using open source in some way. So you need to know what the requirements are of the open source that you're using and how it's being implemented in your software. If you put open source in different parts of your code, as many of you probably know, can be required to make it public, and so you need to really implement a plan for managing it. And then do it right the first time. It's really tough to correct mistakes that involve a lack of including the technical details in a patent application. You typically have to refile, and sometimes that's not possible. So put in the time, money, and planning to do it properly. Steve Jobs once quoted, "Doing it right the first time is a lot easier than having to go back and fix it." He's got a very good point. There's a lot of truth in those words. That concludes my talk. Are there any questions? Yes?
Put the slide up that defines what's going to be a software patent and not again, please. You had a nice slide about what was patentable.
So the question was, can I return to the slide that said what might be patentable for software?
Yeah.
Was that this one?
A little after that. Yeah.
Examples of abstract ideas with elements that amount to significantly more than an abstract idea. So something like this might potentially be patentable when implemented as software.
Okay, let's give him a round of applause. And
Thank you very much.
Questions now or later?
later at the end.
The space is available until late, 9 o'clock. If you want to.
Sound check. Can people hear me? Everybody can hear me in the back. You can hear me.
Thanks for your patience, everyone.
Oh, one more. This is another song.
Doesn't matter, you can put them on the same side as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate the ACM Bay Area inviting me. I appreciate Tom Moran suggesting this, and Liana Yee organizing it all. I'm Bob Zeidman, and I'm the president of Sfbayacm Consulting. We do consulting on intellectual property cases, engineering expert witness work. So we work with the lawyers to figure out who infringed whose patent or copyright or trade secrets. I'm also the president of Software Analysis and Forensic Engineering, also known as SAFE Corporation, and we've developed, I essentially developed tools for comparing software-defined copying, and that's mostly what I'm going to talk about today. The tool is called Code Suite. It's a suite of tools. I'm going to talk about the technology behind it. Steve did a great job, I think, of talking about patents and intellectual property. I often do that, but I figured you're a technical crowd, so I'll go into some of the technical details. But if you do want to ask me about intellectual property and some of the cases I've worked on at the end, I'm glad to talk about them. I found something interesting. Steve mentioned a case where he had a client that went up against a company he referred to as Banana. And interestingly enough, I had a similar experience with a company, let's call it Orange. And his company made cell phones. The company I was going up against, representing the client, this was like 2000, so this company was a computer company, so it must be something different. But they had hired a company, a small company, to create some, to use their devices inside their computers. And after a few years, they said, thank you very much, we're going to give this technology to a big company that we feel more comfortable working with. And fortunately, my client hired me. They hired the lawyer hired me, and they had patents. And despite being a very small company against a very big company, they were able to get compensated for the fact that they had created this technology. So an important thing to keep in mind. Sometimes people say, well, how can you win against a big company? And if you've got, and also sometimes, I don't hear this too often, well, a big company wouldn't do anything that's unethical. Ethics is in the eye of the beholder, so you better be holding some patents. I'm the author of the Software IP Detectives, I should say Software IP Detectives handbook, it's a typo, about intellectual property. And I worked on some famous cases. I was also going to mention that sometimes on my slide I mentioned that I am the named inventor on 22 patents. As of yesterday, it's 23. And Steve had mentioned prosecuting patents, which means writing them up and then fighting over years with the patent office. And, that's pretty common. So yesterday, I got a letter in the mail, actually my wife got it, and she said, oh, you got something from the patent office. And that's really nothing I ever look forward to, because it's yet another reason why my patent is invalid. Because, and this time, by the way, this patent was supposedly invalid because it was abstract, not novel, and, well, actually, I think we finally decided it was novel. It was abstract, but if you combine something like 7 other inventions, it was obvious to combine those and get my invention. And by the way, I think most engineers know that very few things are invented these days which are not built on some existing technology. Maybe nothing is. So I've been fighting for 2 years for this patent. Actually, it's a continuation of a patent that I fought for 12 years for. And that patent was issued after an appeal. This patent, I just thought, okay, this is going back and forth. It seemed to be getting worse every time. The lawyer who's working for me, we made some arguments. I thought they were good arguments, but the examiner never believed any of our arguments. In fact, he gave what's called a final rejection, which, you have to do some special stuff to get past the final rejection. And basically, we made the argument that you think it's final, you think we don't have any more arguments, but here's one more good argument for you. And the letter came back and it said the patent was allowed, which by surprise. But that happens. I mean, it's amazing how you go back and forth sometimes, and all of a sudden, the examiner just, it depends how tenacious they are, but sometimes they just say, okay, you win. I mean, I think we had a good case. I think his arguments were bad, but it just surprised me that it's like a step function. So I've worked on some famous cases. I'll just mention these because people find it pretty interesting. So how many people have seen The Social Network, the movie? Okay. For those who haven't, I suggest you see it. Aaron Sorkin, the writer, director, in my opinion, is one of the best writers, I was going to say in Hollywood, but one of the best writers who's ever been in Hollywood. It's a great movie, I think. And for years, I couldn't tell people that I worked on that case with Mark Zuckerberg against the Harvard guys, the Winklevoss twins. And I tell people I'm in the movie because there's a scene where Zuckerberg holds up some paper and says, I didn't copy your software. And I say, if you zoom in, you'll see my name on that report. Symantec, the IRS, was actually a tax case where we measured the intellectual property and software and saved Symantec $500 million in taxes. And they were extremely happy and threw a party where everybody except me got really, well, I'd say they drank very heavily. Oracle v. Google, how many people are familiar with the Oracle v. Google case? Okay, a lot of strong opinions. I won't go into too much detail because I want to get through the entire presentation in one piece. So I worked for, good question, I worked for Oracle, and Oracle hired my company actually, after I had written some articles about why I thought Oracle was right. Basically, I was disappointed they didn't hire us from the beginning, and I can tell you that the case would have turned out differently had they hired us from the beginning. But they did eventually hire us for the appeal. I believe that Oracle was in the right, and I believe that the judgment protects software development, despite the fact that you'll hear that it's just the opposite. But I can talk about that later. And I'll just mention Diora and Bandari versus Serene Technologies. I'm sure, well, I'd be very surprised if anyone's heard of this case, but it's just a source of pride for me because it's a case in India. And I got a call one day that I had been approved by the courts. I didn't know anything about this. I've been approved by the courts to be an expert, not my company, by the way, but me personally, to compare software and see if it was copied. And so I flew to India. This was just a few weeks ago. And when I got there, one of the parties had objected to me working on the case as a neutral expert, not hired by either party, but hired by the court. One of the parties objected, and they kept filing objections with various appeals courts, and it kept getting turned down. It was actually accepted by the Supreme Court of India while I was there, and I was told to go home. But I had just barely started the comparison. They told me to go home until the Supreme Court rules, and the Supreme Court took about a week and a half to rule that I was acceptable as an expert, so sometime in the near future I'm going back. So I'm going to talk about software plagiarism detection, defining source code, software correlation, tools, and then we'll have a Q&A. Okay. So software plagiarism detection. So I don't know if people have heard of this term. It's actually an area of computer science. And I sometimes have a lot of slides. I just boiled it down to one. This is a famous diagram that was created by one of the people who was involved in the field of software plagiarism detection. This is one of the programs. The field has existed since probably the early 80s as a formal field of study in computer science. And Jankowitz was somebody who wrote a paper on one of the programs that he had come up with. He's a professor somewhere, I don't recall where. And the thing I'd like to point out is here's a flow diagram of how you detect plagiarism. And at the bottom right corner, you'll see, you go through this algorithm and you detect plagiarism. Well, I'm actually not, let's see, a friend. I don't get a great response from people in this scientific community because the first thing I did when I started getting into this field is I said, there is one major problem with this algorithm and any algorithm like it, because at the bottom right, it says plagiarism detection. I don't even like the name of the field, because plagiarism implies that something malicious happened. And no computer program is going to determine, at least no algorithm that compares software is going to determine something malicious happened. There's a lot of reasons why software can be copied and is legal, can look copied, can look similar. So I had a big disagreement with the people in the field from the beginning. I tried to be nice about it. They weren't all that nice to me. So, because there's the definition of plagiarism. It's the unauthorized use or close imitation. And so how would a program know whether the use is authorized or not? It has a bias to it. The entire field has a bias to it. Well, the other thing is, these tools would all come up with a number, usually between 0 and 100. And there would be rules like if it's 70 or more, it's plagiarized. And if it's less than 70, it's not plagiarized. So again, users can't determine plagiarism. Even if they could, what does that number mean? Who determined that 70 or more is plagiarized? And I mean, it's just an arbitrary number. There's a lot of problems with the field. Like I said, the people in the field don't particularly like me, because I pointed these out. So the problem I had was there's no definition of what it means to be plagiarized or how much code, does it need to be plagiarized, a little or a lot. There were no references, there were no standards, there was no theoretical basis. The first paper I wrote kept getting rejected from conferences and journals, and was finally accepted in my IEEE conference in Hawaii, which was nice. I got to go to Hawaii. And, one of the rejections I got was that I didn't have a theoretical basis for my work. I was kind of a practical person just saying, look, here's how you detect how close software is. I called it correlation. And they said, we don't have a theoretical basis. So I actually talked to a mentor of mine at Stanford, Professor Mike Flynn, who's famous for computer architecture, the SIMD, MIMD classification, for example, of computer architecture. Really great guy. He retired a few years ago. He's been a mentor for me for years. And I said, Mike, you've published 250 papers, and I can't publish one, so maybe you've got some advice. And he said, well, the first piece of advice is it's going to be difficult because you don't have a PhD and you don't teach at a university. So regardless of what you've done, it's going to be difficult. So I said, well, they said that I don't have a theory, but I've read every paper in the field, and no paper has a theory. That's one of my issues. And he said, well, it's time for me to create a theory, and then you will be the only one in the field who has a theory. So I did that. And so we actually sat down. He said, bring every information theory book that you've got, bring it to my office at Stanford, we'll get a conference room, we'll spend the entire day figuring out a theory for this stuff. He refused to take any credit. I wanted to give him credit on the paper, but he just, he wouldn't do that. So, and also that what's out in the field created, had a bias based on what the creator thought. So for example, these are academicians. I'll give you one big example. In academia, nobody really cared if somebody's comments were copied, because comments are not functional code. But in actuality, in the legal profession, comments, in trying to determine copyright infringement, which is what the legal definition is, the legal issue that we're looking for, comments are really important. First of all, comments are copyrightable. But more importantly, I've been in a lot of cases where you find comments that are identical, very unusual comments, misspellings maybe, or just some weird way of phrasing things. And the defendant in that case is going to have a really hard time saying, I'll say it's impossible for them to make this kind of argument. I've had guilty defendants make this argument, and I'll interject here that I've worked for plaintiffs and defendants, and I've also, regardless of who I work for, we have a policy that if we find information that's bad for the client, we tell them. We're not going to hide that. And then the client decides, do they want to settle the case, do they want to keep us, do they want to hire somebody else, what do they want to do? And so that's happened. But so the point is that if a comment, a very unique comment, is copied in two sets of code, most likely the surrounding code was copied and modified to the point where it's hard to know for certain that that code was copied. So we rule out every single possibility, and some things are copied, but we can't prove it because it might just be coincidence. And I'll go through the reasons that we rule things out. It only means that when we find something that can only be explained by copying, then we know that copying took place, and then we can look at the surrounding code and make a judgment about how much code was copied. So comments are really important, but in academia, all the plagiarism tools, until I got involved, all the plagiarism detection tools just threw out comments because the feeling was, who cares if the student copies a comment? So it's, that was based on their bias as being, professors who were looking for something different than a generic tool. They were looking to solve their own problems within their own classes. So we needed a metric. And first thing we need to do is define source code, which seems pretty basic. I think we're all, or most of us, are computer scientists. But defining source code really depends on what you're using it for. So in this case, we're not defining it in order to beautify it or compile it. We're defining it in terms that make it easier to determine whether something was copied or not. So this is just a cool diagram. Everybody knows this little animated thing. I like this for the non-sophisticated viewers, but I spent so much time on it, I show it. There's the source code going in and the object code coming out, or machine code. I've got another diagram a little later that leverages that one. So with the source code elements, what I did is I broke it up into, and basically I based it on my experience and other experts' experience. When we examine code, what are we looking for? And I basically just automated that. In fact, I thought this was a really simple thing to do, and then I found out nobody else was doing it. And I said, well, we look at instructions, and I defined what instructions are. And, you know, these are pretty common definitions, but it's, again, this is not for creating a parser or a lexer or a compiler. It's specifically for looking for things where we can detect copies. So instructions are made up of control words, specifiers. That's a term that I thought maybe I invented, but other people actually use it with a very similar meaning. The thing about specifiers, well, it's control words, specifiers, operators. The interesting thing about specifiers, and this took a lot of research on my part, is that specifiers don't actually have a function in the code. They specify, for example, a data type. And I found it was really important to separate a specifier that just doesn't actually perform a function but reserves space for data, for example, from a control word that actually controls the flow of the program. And that's especially important if we're eventually going to find a way of functionally comparing code, which my tool doesn't do, and as far as I know, nobody's figured out a really good way of doing it. But if we ever do it, a specifier is very different from an instruction that controls the flow of the program. So there's operators, there's identifiers, which end up being really important. Variables, constants, functions, labels, and then comments and strings. It turns out that I lump comments and strings together, even though they're different types of code elements, that when you're looking for copying, there's really no difference that we found between a comment and a string, because they don't affect the function. They're really meant for a viewer. One's meant for the viewer who's using the program, and one's meant for the viewer who is reading the code. And then just a nice colored diagram that shows the code and divides it up into its various components. And the thing that I realized is we need to divide up the code and compare them separately. And that's something that I don't believe was ever done before. Some plagiarism detection tools would consider code to be text. In fact, there's a pretty famous one. I don't know if anyone's familiar with MOS, Measure of Software Similarity. Okay, it's used in academia, came out of a professor at Berkeley who's now at Stanford. He's the head of the computer science department, Alex Aiken. I know him. We have an interesting relationship in a lot of ways. But basically, his tool considered code to be text. And there's a big problem with that. There's a lot of problems. It creates a really interesting algorithm. He hashes it. He does a statistical analysis that's based on DNA matching. Now, DNA matching is such a tough problem that the people who solved it had to use statistical analysis. So basically, my understanding is they would take chunks of DNA and they would just throw them at each other. They'd kind of hash the sequences and throw the hashes at each other to see if they found any patterns. And if they didn't, they'd throw some more into it. And they keep doing this over and over again until they found a pattern. In fact, if any of you read about this, it was a big controversy at the time before the human DNA was mapped, the human genome, because there was another group, I think, funded by the government. No, there was a group at Berkeley, actually, and they were, and there was a private group, and the private group had this statistical method of doing it, and the group funded by the government that was at Berkeley, as I recall, said, you're just throwing stuff at random, you may never find the solution that way. And the commercial group says, but if you try to go through every combination like you're doing, it's going to take decades to find the solution with the compute power we've got. And it turns out the commercial group that was doing it statistically did find it, and they shared the credit for it, which is another story. But the MOS program would do a similar technique, and my argument was, when it's DNA and there's so many combinations, you have to do it that way. But when you're comparing code, there's plenty of compute power. Even 15 years ago when I started doing this, there's plenty of compute power to do it brute force. So why do the statistical analysis? You have to let the computer run. Here's another thing, we've got the bias of the person writing the tool. In academia, I completely understand you can't let a computer run for a week. Nowadays it takes an hour, but back then, 15 years ago, it might take a week to do this comparison. And no professor wants to wait a week before determining if his or her students were cheating. So I understand that. But in the legal field, where you might have $100 million at stake, running a computer for a week is a no-brainer. I mean, it's certainly worthwhile to do that. So what I did was not treat it like text and not tokenize it. Well, first of all, if you treat it like text, you can understand if somebody does a global search and replace on a lot of variables, a lot of the hashes are just going to miss. And you're going to say, oh, this is different. The hashes are different. Unless you get lucky and find a space without variables that have changed, you're just not going to find it. And that happens a lot, actually. The other tools would tokenize it, put in tokens, but putting in tokens, you're getting rid of the variable names, which hurt key. Most of the cases I've worked on, many of them, we find variable names that are either matching or similar. Sometimes people will rewrite them, but they want to keep some information in there. They don't want to change index to XYZ because that doesn't mean anything. But they might change index to index 1. They might change matrix index to index of matrix because you want that information. It's critical information. So a lot of the tools were throwing that stuff out. So I decided to divide everything up and do each thing separately. So if people changed every variable name, let's look at the instructions. If they changed the instructions, for they substituted for whiles, do whiles, those kind of things. If else, they changed the case statements. You still see some sequence of instructions that were identical because if they changed variable names, function names, they changed the comments, and they changed the strings, and they changed the sequence of instructions. They basically changed everything so it's completely different, and then it's not really a copy of the thing. So it's a look at all these things separately. So if they went to the trouble of changing one group of code elements, there still might be similarity in other code elements. And then I came up, I defined correlation, 0 to 1 or 0 to 100. 0 is if the source code is completely unrelated. 1 if it's completely identical. And then we looked at exact matches, partial matches. Functional matches is something I'd like to do in the future, and if anyone has any ideas, let me know. People have been looking at trying to match functionality. It's a very, very difficult problem, as you can imagine, because there's so many ways to get the same function. And in fact, sometimes when people do copy code, they will change the function enough that if you're just doing it, just glancing at it, it looks like a different function. And of course, if you're looking at, some people want to look at compiled code and reverse engineer it, but that's so dependent on the compiler and the language that nobody's been successful except in very limited cases of looking for functional matches. And transformational match is just a generic term for transforming some functionality to some other functionality.
Is there, if you change language, is it considered copying? Like, if you have object and methods in C++ and you do object and methods in Java or something else?
So the question is, if you change languages, is it still considered copying? So for copyright infringement, definitely yes. But copying, one thing that I'll touch on it a little bit. I have other talks where I touch on it a little more. Copyright law encourages copying concepts. And I think people sometimes don't recognize that. So if you look at a program and you figure out how it works, you can even reverse engineer things. The courts have been very clear. They want you to do this. They want you to reverse engineer things, figure out how it works, but then if you create your own version in another language or even in the same language, you can't be looking at the original copy. And really, you shouldn't be the person who even looked at the original copy. You should use a clean room. A clean room says you understand it, you figure it out, you reverse engineer it, you write up a specification, and then through a certain process, I won't go into details, you give it to an independent group of programmers. So if you are looking at it and creating it in a different language, that's copyright infringement. But if you're looking at it, write up how it works functionally, not what the code statements are, but functionally how it works, and use the right process to give it to a independent group of programmers, that's not copyright infringement. Yeah.
I translate all comments in French, for example.
Okay, so the question is if you translate all comments to French, so technically that is still copying. Now if you were to, is it detectable? So that's a really good question. I would say that my tool would not find that. what I found is interesting is that, sometimes I would get a little bit uncomfortable. First of all, the tool is all patented. And the reason it's all patented is because, as Steve mentioned, patents become public, but I still have protection. And going into court, initially I was always challenged because the other party would say, how do your tools work? And if you can't tell us how it works, we're going to challenge it and say it doesn't work, it's not accepted. So by patenting it, I could publish how it worked, and people couldn't take it and do the same thing, at least for a limited time. So I can go into court and explain exactly how it works. Now, the more I explain how it works, the more I'm a little bit concerned people are going to use that to fool the tool. But what I found is, I can tell you only one time that I'm aware of, I turned down a client. Because even the lawyers, they said they understood. Somebody came to my software company and purchased the tool. And they were asking a lot of questions of me about it. And later on, they came to me and they wanted to hire my consulting company to work on a case where they were accused of copying code. So, okay, that's fine. I'm not going to presume anything. But what happened after that is we ran our tools on their code and we found signs of copying. What I found is that software is complex enough that you've really got to spend a lot of time, even with our tool, to fix everything. And I train people on how to use the tool, so you can miss stuff if you don't know what you're looking for. So these people had tried to fix their code and had missed some things. And then they said to me, and I told them, I said, we're always honest with the clients, the requirement of anybody working for me. And I said, look, there is some copying. You've got to decide what you want to do. You can try to fix it. You can hire us to help find another team of people to rewrite the code. You can settle with the other party. You can fire us and find somebody else. And they said, well, what would it take if can we run the tool a few times and just change the things you found? And that's when this is the only time I've ever done that. I talked to the lawyers and I said, I don't think we can work for your client. Because at that point, they were now using us to cover up the copying. They weren't really fixing it, they were covering it up. So, but the thing is, it's so difficult, honestly, unless you're writing a little tiny piece of code. You could translate the comments to French, but if you miss one, we'll probably find it. If the sequence of instructions remains the same, we'll probably find it. A lot of things we'll probably find it.
No, it's an interesting topic. So you can find a company that will help you in your original code. It means the user will use exactly the same algorithm, the same idea. Just tools will not have real code.
So why don't I hold off the questions to the end, and you can ask that again at the end. Yeah. So far, I'm not aware of anything we haven't found, and we worked for innocent defendants who worked with plaintiffs. Facebook was innocent. Facebook. So just a real quick story. In something like 2004, I was working out of my house, and I had just developed these tools, and I started to write about it, and some lawyers were finding out about it. And I got a call from some lawyers, and they said, we're working for this company. They've been accused of stealing code, but they haven't. And we want to image every single computer in the company and send it to you. And we want you to run your tools and use your expertise and figure out if anything was copied. And if not, that's the best situation. We hope it's not, and write up a report. And I got off the phone and I told my wife, I said, wow, we just got the biggest case of my career. This is going to be great. It's going to prove my tools. It's going to make a lot of money. The thing that worries me is I've never heard of this company. They're called the Facebook. So I'm not sure if they can pay their bills. So they pay their bills. And the other thing I'll say is that, and this is really what boosted the career, my consulting business and my software business. I can tell you this now, for a long time I couldn't say anything because there's so many lawsuits going on. The side representing ConnectU, which was the company that the Winklevoss twins at Harvard had created, they hired some consulting company, and they had something like 5 or 6 people working day and night to examine the code. And they issued a report that said, there's 99, if I remember the number, something like 99,000 files, and we've examined 4,000 of them. We chose 4,000 that we thought might be critical, and we examined 4,000 of them, compared that, actually that was of Facebook's code, connected, you had very little code. Then we compared them, and we haven't found any copying, but we believe that there's copying in the other files. And it's just, we're gonna have a lot more time to do this, but we feel confident that it's there. My report said, working alone with my tools, I compared every single one of those 99,000 files, and the full report is on a CD, thousands of pages long, generated by my tool, and I said there was no copying whatsoever. And right after that, they settled the case. So that's when things got good for me. So here, what I did was I came up with correlation. So I divided up the elements. There's a statement correlation, how many statements are correlated, comment and string correlation, identifier, instruction sequence, and overall source code correlation. It's based on something called a match score. A match score is what I call unnormalized correlation. So a match score is basically how many of these elements, once you divide it up into the elements, how many match, okay? And then there were certain rules that I realized, which, this looks fancy, I struggled with some of this for a while, and then once I figured it out, I thought, well, this is really easy, maybe I should have seen this right away. But the main thing is commutativity. So basically, if you're comparing file A against file B, you have to get the same results as if you compare it in the other direction, file B against file A. And some of the tools that were out there didn't seem to have that property. The order that you compared them gave you a different score. And I thought that can't be a useful score. I said identity, the correlation of a single file was equal to the correlation, this is the match score, sorry, the match score of a single file is equal to the match score of a file compared to itself. Okay, some of these things seem obvious, but it's weird because some of the algorithms didn't do this, and when I was first fooling with this, I thought, my numbers weren't coming out this way, and I knew there was something wrong. And then correlation said the correlation between two files, file fn and fn, okay, the correlation had to be equal to the match score, in other words, how much match between the two files, divided by the maximum possible match. Now this was, I think, my key development. This really threw me. I actually used the tool without this at first, and what that meant was correlation scores range from 0 to infinity. And I knew that was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what to do about it. And other tools that are out there, like Moss, will do some kind of division to get it to be between 0 and 100. But what happens is, the way to fool these tools are you take a little bit of code and you copy it into a gigantic file. And the number comes out really small. And then it's ignored. I told you that the rule is if it's less than 70, that it's not linearized. Well, the way to get all your numbers less than 70 is you can just take copy code word for word and just add a whole bunch of comments to it, or a whole bunch of dead code. And all of a sudden, those numbers will go down. And I knew I didn't want that. If a small piece of code is embedded in a big piece of code, I need to have a big number. And the way I did that was with creating correlation where I divided by the maximum possible score. So if you've got a file that has, let's say, 10 identifiers in it, and another file has 100 identifiers or 1,000 identifiers, the denominator here is, sorry, I said max, I think I said max, it should be min. You divide by the smallest number of identifiers, which is 10. So if 10 identifiers match, then you've got 10 out of the smallest between the two of them is 10, you've got 100. Is your score. 100 says somewhere buried in this code is completely identical identifiers. And that was actually a really big key. So now you can find stuff that's buried, whereas the other tools I think don't do that. And then I also had this axiom that the maximum match score has to be the minimum match score of the two files. So in other words, it's basically saying the same kind of thing. If you've got a file with 10 identifiers, you've got another file with 1,000 identifiers, the maximum number of identifiers that match is going to be 10. That kind of makes sense, right? But if you don't think about that clearly, you can start coming up with these things that hide copying. So as I say it, it sounds pretty silly, pretty obvious, but it took me a while And I don't think the other tools still, I don't think they use this kind of measure. So then, I already talked about, you've got the correlation, statement, comment, and string. I combined comment and string because I couldn't find any difference between them. It didn't really matter if something was a comment or a string for the point of detecting copy. And then I realized that in my mind, I had said, well, this is going to be a distance measure. When I combined all the correlations, it's going to be a square root of a sum of squares, which is what I call S correlation at the bottom. But as I started doing this, I really wanted to avoid assumptions. My feeling was it should be S correlation, but I realized there are other ways. I could do a weighted correlation, an average correlation, maximum correlation. So what I did is I ran a whole bunch of tests on open source code, and I took parts of it and purposely made all kinds of modifications to it. And I tested which of these ways of combining the correlations into a single correlation score popped what I knew was copied ahead of time to the top of the list. And the solution there was S correlation, like I suspected. But one thing I didn't want to do is I criticized people in academia for making assumptions about what they thought would work. And in fact, a lot of the way they tested these algorithms, they say, oh, here's the algorithm I think is going to work. I'll give it to my grad students. My grad students will manually look over the code and tell me if it worked. Well, I don't think that's exactly an unbiased way of doing this. So I wanted to avoid that. So I said, let me run the test on a huge amount of code and see which of these scores brought what I knew. I knew what was already copied and modified. Which score brought most of this to the top of the list, and was the S correlation, the square root of the sum of squares, and four-dimensional distance. So the tools, here are some of the tools that have been available. This is JPLAG, which I don't know how often it's used anymore. It's available online, and I'll put these slides online, so if you want to check them out. I did a comparison against JPLAG, MOS, which came out of Stanford. Initially Berkeley, the professor moved over to Stanford, and that's free. I've actually spent some time with parents call me up sometimes, and they say my son or daughter has been accused of cheating in college because they used MOS. And I'll tell you that I've sent them my articles that compared my tool, CodeSuite, to MOS, but also point out all the deficiencies in MOS. It's a very quick and dirty tool, but to give someone an F in a computer science course, it shouldn't be used that way. And I've helped clear some students. Although one story I'll tell you that was interesting, I had a woman called me up and said, my son has been accused of copying code. It's at the California University, and the professor's going to fail him. They don't always release the results. A lot of times it's private. But she was able to get the output of MOS, and she said he was accused of copying code from a young woman in the class. And I'm not sure how they determined that, but that was a determination. He was going to fail the class, and it would affect his record, his ability to get a job, she felt. And he swears that he didn't copy code. So I actually looked at the output of MOS, did some manual research, manual searching online, which our tool does automatically now. And, but I didn't have the tools, I just had the output to look at, but I did some hand searching. And I called her back and I said, well, I've got some good news and some bad news. The good news is your son definitely did not copy off the young woman in class. The bad news is they both copied off an online site, and she did a much better job of disguising it. So there's my company, Code Matches. You can talk about it. It's available for free, but you have to pay for licenses to use it. A lot of the functionality is available for free, but the main functionality of comparing and searching online, you have to pay for. And here's the little graphic I have for, comparing source code, putting it through something to measure correlation, and then setting off an alarm. But now here's the other thing that's really missing from the plagiarism detection tools, and that is that there are a whole bunch of reasons that code can be correlated and not be copied. This is really critical. This is why using something like MOS at a university to accuse a student of copying is really a bad idea, because code can use two programs can use the same third-party code, and it'll be correlated. And perfectly legal, unless the professor in the course said they weren't allowed to. Right, in that previous story, they told me, I asked first, did the professor allow copying of third-party code? And I was told no, so that was a problem. But if it's allowed, they'll be correlated, and it's not copied. Code generation tools. So you've got automatic code generation tools. The code's going to look correlated, but not because it was copied. Commonly used identifier names. You're going to have index, count. If you're in a certain if the software is intended for a certain use, medical field, you'll have medical terms. And the fact that two programs use the same medical terms is not a sign of copy. Common algorithms. So, I don't know, a bubble sort. People use a bubble sort, and there's going to be some correlation because people know how to do it. Maybe even take the code from a textbook. And common author. This is one of the more interesting things. If a programmer at one company writes code and moves to another company, then they're going to write code in a very similar way, even though it's not copied. And that'll come up as correlation. So what we do is my consulting company, and anyone I train, by the way, we offer training for anyone who wants to go off on their own and do this, and we promote them on the software site. We teach people how to look for these things. So what we do is we eliminate all of these reasons. Now something may look like, if someone copies automatically generated code, they actually copy it, then we usually will eliminate that and say, well, maybe it's copied, but it's explained by an automatic code generation tool. We're not going to accuse someone of copyright infringement, which is pretty serious, if there's another reasonable explanation. Now, to counter that, I have been involved in cases where you're probably familiar with the GUID, the ID that's generated automatically. So there was at least one case, I think two cases, where the code, this automatic code looked copied, and our initial thought was, oh, well, this is automatically generated code, so we can't say that it's copied. But the GUID it's a huge string of numbers and letters that's generated randomly, automatically, each time you run the tool, was identical in both sets of code. So that was the clue that we had to look at manually to say, okay, this is automatically generated code, but it was automatically generated once, and then literally copied completely the next time. And I remember one time I had to argue with an expert. Unfortunately, you'll get some experts who will say, we get paid pretty well, so some experts will say whatever you want, because they feel they're being paid to do that. And we actually had to argue with someone who claimed that it was a possibility, though small, it was a possibility that these GUIDs would be the same. And so I had to, calculate the age of the universe, and I don't know, the number of seconds that had passed, and said, if you click this once every second, there's still a tiny possibility that you get the same one. So what we do is, here's a flow chart. We actually check for all these things. And now we have a tool called Source Detective, which is connected to Bing, the Bing API. Google doesn't offer an API. Yahoo did, but we're not that sure that how long Yahoo is going to be supporting that. But Bing has an API, so our tool goes to the search engine. Because what happened was I was once involved in a case where I said, oh, there were 200 identifier names that were identical and looked unique. I've never seen these before. And they said, well, how do you know that other people don't just use these identifier names? Maybe other people do and you're not aware of it. And I said, well, I put some of them into Google and I couldn't find them. They said, well, how many did you put into Google? This was at a deposition, the lawyer was asking me. And I said, well, 3, 4, 5. So he said, so out of 200, you put in, let's say 5, so you're really not sure about those other 195. And, I thought it was a ridiculous question, but I realized when you talk to a jury or a judge, they're going to say, well, maybe they copied 5 out of 190. You didn't really check. And so we made a tool. I made a tool. Actually, I worked with some other people. We made a tool that would automatically check now everything. We get a full report of what's found on Bing. So now we can go in and say, well, we checked all 200 or 2,000 or 200,000. And that's it. Time for questions. Yeah.
So do you have any incident like, I heard all the success stories, but
Any failure stories?
Okay, so the question is, are there any failure stories? And I think it depends what you mean. I think, so in my opinion, we have not had a failure in that we did something wrong. I mean, look, we all make mistakes, and so I'm not saying we didn't make mistakes. We've made mistakes, but we've been able to find them and fix them. We have worked for clients where there was, okay, I guess one story comes to mind. If this is what you're talking about. The client hired my company to do some analysis, and it was a big law firm in Washington, D.C., and they were under a very tight deadline. So somebody who was working for me did the work, ran the tool, and then generates a report. He looked at it, but we had to catch a flight to Washington to present it to the law firm and the CEO of the company. And they were a defendant accused of copying. And my colleague and I are looking at it on the plane, and everything looks okay. And I made a few slides, and we get to this law firm, and the partner of the law firm is there, and the CEO of the company, and I put it up on the screen, and I say, well, everything's okay, because if you look at this, you can see side by side, because eventually you have to look at side by side code. Our tool puts out reports, but eventually you have to look at the code side by side. So I put it up there, and I said, you're okay, because look, this is different. And then I looked at it and I said, one thing's really interesting here. I said, the code, what happened is, I said, here's some code that's all the same, but it's very generic code. Okay, so I said, you don't have to worry about it. I'm showing you an example of why someone else might say it's copied, but it's generic code, so we don't feel it's copied. But I noticed that in the plaintiff's code, there were comments, and in my client's code, every single place there was a comment, there was a blank line in their code.
Text comment, text difference.
Right. The comment, there was no reason for there to be spaces, right, blank lines, unless somebody had removed comments. So, and it wasn't just like one place. There'd be like 3 blank lines where in the plaintiff's code there were 3 comments, right? So I looked at this, and I started looking at the code, and I said, I have bad news for you. Actually, somebody did copy. And they were very nice about it. They said, are you sure? What about this? What about that? And I said, no, there's no other explanation. People can't, by chance, put in the exact number of lines that correspond to the missing comments. And so they thanked us. My colleague and I got a nice tour of Washington. We went to the Senate and sat in on some Senate discussion someplace, and then we went home. We never heard from them again. Yes.
So, even if the source codes are different, how would you detect if there is IP infringement, for example, patents, things like that?
So the question is, if the source code is different, how would you detect something like patent infringement? So we do that, but it's a much more manual analysis. So we really have to look at the functionality. It's much more difficult, it's much more subjective. I think we still have some very high standards that we apply. And I've created for my company, I've created processes for doing this, but if we ever had functional correlation, which I'm not aware that anyone does, it'd be nice to run a tool and just, oh, these functions are the same. But so far, no one has that, so it's very less predictable. And you just need people who know software, who know how to read patents. Patents are really fascinating. Some people don't like this, but patents are open to interpretation. And for me, it's fun to interpret it. And to be perfectly honest, we try to interpret it in the best light for our client. But the other side tries to interpret it the other way. And my feeling is that we'll both go to court, and the judge will decide whose interpretation is correct. Sometimes it's a difficult call. When the patent says, taking one branch in one case and taking another branch in another case, I'm just making something up, but does that mean it can't take a third branch? Well, you have to look at the patent history, you have to look at what the patentee argued. If the patentee ever argued with the patent office that it can't take a third branch, then it can't take a third branch. But if it never came up during the examination of the patent, then it's open to interpretation. And so we'll interpret it one way, the other side will interpret it another way, the judge will decide. If I cannot tell what I think is an interesting story. So if a patent's interpreted, there's this fine line that you need to walk. A plaintiff with a patent wants the patent to be interpreted really broadly. So in other words, everything infringes, right? But if you do that, that means there's prior art, which invalidates your patent because everyone does this, so your patent's no good. So there's this fine line. You want it as broad as possible, but not too broad. And where is that? You don't know. So I worked for a defendant in a patent case where an invention was, the plaintiff, I was working for the defendants, the plaintiff got carried away and said, we want to interpret it really broadly. And the judge didn't have any familiarity with patent cases. And she took an interpretation that was probably even broader than the plaintiff wanted. And it was a crazy interpretation. And the lawyers and I were just really disappointed because like every device in this category infringed given this interpretation. This claim construction is what it's called. But I had this idea that I really liked, and it ended up winning the case for my client. I said, you know what, if we adopt, the judges told us we have to adopt this really broad interpretation. And we had another patent that did something very different than the invention. But, so I'll go into a little more detail. This was for a programmable remote control. And programmable was the kind of thing where you've got like a universal, you take your remote control and you press it, you take the universal and it captures the signals, and so it programs the signals into this universal. So now you can use the universal on that TV, and you program another TV, you program a DVR or something. So the universal is programmed by reading the signals in and learning them. But the judge ruled that programmable means it has a microprocessor in it and can be made to do any of these functions. Even if it doesn't do any of these functions, it can be made to do these functions. So we were really upset because every remote control that had a microprocessor, which is every remote control in existence at the time, infringed, including my clients. But I realized we had this patent that did something very different, but the patent described a device that had a processor in it. And I said, you know what? If we build the device in this other prior art patent, and it's got a microprocessor in it, and we change the firmware in it, we can change the firmware to do what the patent holder's invention does, and then the judge will believe that that the patent's no good because it was prior art. So I don't know if that's clear. So in other words, we took an invention that did something completely different, reprogrammed it, and the judge said, oh yeah, well it's got a processor, it's programmable, and once you reprogram it, it does what the invention does, so the patent's no good. Now between us, I think it was a wrong interpretation, but it worked for my client. I think the correct interpretation was a programmable remote control, and my client did not have a programmable remote control. It was not programmable. So I think we won, but for the wrong reason. But justice was served anyway.
By the wrong precedent.
Yeah, well, it also, it destroyed, it really hurt the patent holder who might have had a decent patent. But, look, that's the game. They went too far. I think they should not have tried to sue my client because my client's product didn't infringe. They should have sued people that really did infringe. That's what happens, yeah.
Why functional match is a problem? Function is an interface. It's a black box. As long as the black box is implemented independently, functional match should not be a problem.
Okay, so, and this will be the last question. I'll stick around a little bit if people want me to answer anything else, or if they want Steve to answer something. The question is, why is functional match a problem? So to be clear, for copyright infringement, functional match doesn't matter. And in fact, I've worked on some cases where the lawyers didn't understand it. Or maybe they understood it, but they were trying to press it. They said, your program functions the same way as our program, therefore it's copyright infringement. And unfortunately, there are some judges who don't understand. I worked on a case in West Virginia, you can look it up if you want. They don't have a lot of software cases. And the plaintiff there was saying, well, your software functions the same way as our code functions, therefore it's copyright infringement. And I had to argue that copyright doesn't cover functionality. And I was successful, and our case set a precedent in the Second Circuit, which covers West Virginia, which I was really proud of. But it's frightening because some judges don't get that.
But it would be patent infringement.
But right, that was the other thing, but it would be patentable. So if they had a patent on their software, then they could say, and that's why I want to have functional correlation for patent and trade secret cases.
If the same functionality is achieved with the same method,
then it could be patent, related issue. But just being functionally equivalent doesn't mean that it is infringing with anything.
Well, being functionally equivalent could be infringing if there's a patent.
Yes, if there is a patent.
And it could be infringing on a trade secret. We didn't talk much about trade secrets, but trade secrets are basically, can be anything. Functional, it can be expressive. Trade secrets are very broad. But with trade secret, you have to show the person actually took it from you.
Exactly, yeah.
So they worked for you and they left. And in fact, in the case I just mentioned, well, they had a trade secret case, but honestly, they didn't know what to do with trade secrets. I think because trade secrets are so nebulous, that in that case, the plaintiff could have made a trade secret claim. I think it would have failed, but trade secrets generally go further in the system because it's harder. There's not well-defined rules for what's a trade secret and how you infringe or misappropriate it. But because they went with copyright, well, they went with copyright because they thought the code was copied. And it was only when they got the code during the case and they compared it that they found it wasn't copied, so they switched well, they didn't switch, they still called it copied, but they didn't know how to make that case anymore. It was a copyright case, there's no copied code, so they tried to make what's called non-literal infringement. I can talk about that separately, but the one thing I want to tell you is I think we realized that we had won the case at the deposition of the other expert on the other side. A very nice guy, very honest, but at the break I had a funny feeling. I was with the attorneys when the other expert was being deposed under oath, and we took a break, lunch break or something, and at the break I told the attorneys, I said, ask him where he learned about copyright infringement, software copyright infringement. And they said, why? And I said, well, just ask him. I have a feeling. Part of it was I keep my two companies separate, my software company and consulting. I really try to, I run both of them and I know everything that's going on, but I try to maintain some kind of privacy. So I said, just ask him. I have a funny feeling. So they asked him, they said, where did you learn about copyright infringement? He said, oh, I read Bob's book. So at that point, I figured we probably won the case. So, and we did. So thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, and I'll be around for a little bit.
Any other question for Steve?
If anybody has questions, I'll be at the front.
Well, thank you for coming, and hope to see you next time.